The wind blows where it chooses, and you hear the sound of it, says Jesus. We know what he means this week. We have seen and felt the wind blow. We have heard its sound. The wind blows where it chooses. Not exactly the explanation we'd like to hear when we call one more time to inquire about when the power might come back on. Not really the answer we ever want when we ask questions big or small. But this is so like Jesus, isn't it? It seems that he's always giving answers we don't want, answers to questions we didn't quite ask, answers we don't really understand. In our reading for today, we meet a man named Nicodemus. Nicodemus, we read, is a leader of the Jews, a Pharisee, a VIP, as it were, with a public reputation to uphold. Even though this is only chapter 3 of John's Gospel, still the beginning of the story, Jesus has already been making quite a splash in the community. Nicodemus, being socially connected the way he is, has of course heard about this Jesus fellow. And he wants to sort out for himself what all the fuss is about. He's heard a lot of astonishing stories. Stories of people leaving their everyday lives behind to follow Jesus. Stories of water turned into wine at wedding feasts. Stories of Jesus making a real scene at a temple where folks were changing money. Nicodemus is intrigued and interested. He suspects that some of this might be fake news, and he wants to see for himself what's really going on. What better place to go than to the source, to the man himself? And so, under cover of darkness, Nicodemus heads out to meet this Jesus. Nick at night, if you will. Nicodemus and Jesus have a pretty lengthy conversation in which they cover a lot of ground. The signs Jesus has been performing, the need to be born from above, and the tricky physical aspects of such a second birth, the finer distinctions between flesh and spirit, the physics of the wind. It seems Nicodemus has a hard time keeping up with the fast pace of this conversation, and who can blame him? Remember, this is his first conversation with Jesus. He's still getting used to the befuddlement a conversation with Jesus often seems to bring. Perhaps Nicodemus is frustrated or tired, or perhaps he just has other places to be. But for whatever reason, Nicodemus finally boils his visit down to one simple question. I get the feeling this one question is really at the center of all of his questions. How can these things be? How can it be, Nicodemus asks, finally putting into words the question that's been burning in his heart for God knows how long. How can these things be? If we're honest, it's a question that burns in our hearts too. Sometimes we ask it after watching the evening news. We see news this week of an explosion in Damascus killing at least 40 people targeted for their religious beliefs. We read this week that women and men in Afghanistan who have risked life and limb to support U.S. military operations there likely will no longer be allowed to apply for special visas to seek safety here. We see pictures of a Jewish cemetery vandalized right here in Rochester. We hear this week about the serious threats of violence against our JCC and other JCCs around the country. How can these things be? Sometimes we ask this question after taking a long, hard look at ourselves. No matter how hard we try, we can't seem to set aside the resentment we feel for the person who hurt us so many years ago. Too often we find ourselves saying hurtful things when what we really want is to just try and connect with the people around us. We're filled with self-doubt, even though the people around us don't seem to think we're that bad. How can these things be? And friends, sometimes we ask this question when we come to church. We receive communion, the bread of life and the cup of forgiveness, but we're not really sure how to make sense of that. We hear incredible stories from Scripture of miraculous healings and supernatural events, and we feel more skeptical than faithful. We want to receive the gift of God's grace, but it really does seem too good to be true. How can these things be? How can these things be? For such a simple question, it can be one of the hardest for us to say out loud. When we feel overwhelmed by the suffering in the world, when we feel full of doubt, when we can't see a way forward through the challenges we face, in those moments when the world just seems so broken, the moments when we feel broken, these are the moments we find ourselves asking, how can these things be? I think this is why Nicodemus came to visit Jesus by night. He was overwhelmed by the question he'd been holding on to so tightly. He'd tried to rationalize and reason his way to an answer, but he just couldn't get there. And he didn't want his friends and neighbors to know about what was brewing in his soul. Remember, this is John's gospel, where the stories of Jesus are interwoven with the motif of light and dark. It matters in John's telling that Nicodemus came to Jesus at night in the dark. Perhaps it was even the dark night of Nicodemus's soul. When he finally gets the question off his chest, when in the middle of the night Nicodemus finally finds a way to ask Jesus the question he so needs to ask, Jesus answers him. And the answer makes us modern-day Christians, well, it makes us at least a little bit uncomfortable. You must be born again, says Jesus, or born from above in some translations. Born again talk. This stuff makes us mainline Protestants a little itchy under the collar. In our world today, we've come to understand the phrase born again to really have one of two meanings. I'd guess that most of us have at one point or another been asked, are you born again? And we know that's usually code for either, are you saved like us? Or, are you crazy like them? But friends, neither of those uses of born again is all that accurate. And we certainly know that neither is very helpful. We've seen the damage people of faith can do when they get too focused on figuring out who's in and who's out. And we've seen the pain and alienation caused by belittling any group of people wholesale without taking the time to get to know the individual people in front of us. And even more importantly, understanding born again as a litmus test for either salvation or sanity is not at all what Jesus had in mind. Our reading for this morning ends before Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus is over, but a few verses later, Jesus helps to clarify what it means to be born again. To be born again is to come out of darkness and into the light. Nicodemus comes to visit Jesus in the darkness of night, and he leaves in the darkness too. He'll make two more appearances in John's gospel, and it's not until very near the end that Nicodemus will finally allow his faith to be seen in the light of day. After the crucifixion, it is Nicodemus, along with Joseph of Arimathea, who will help prepare Jesus' body for the tomb. This is likely years after Nicodemus's nocturnal conversation with Jesus. It's years before Nicodemus is ready to make his faith public, ready to choose light over darkness. To be born again is to come out of darkness and into the light. Or to put it another way, our darkness offers us an opportunity to be born once again into the light. Perhaps Nicodemus comes to visit Jesus at night because he's afraid to be seen by others. Maybe it's because he's afraid of the darkness creeping around the edges of his own soul. But whatever the reason for his visit in the dark, we know this: new life always begins in darkness. Whether we mean new life nurtured in the waters of a womb, or new life beginning to grow under layers of snow and cold, dark soil, whether we mean the new life that comes from healing our pain and accepting forgiveness, or the new life of resurrection that happened in the darkness of a tomb, we know that new life always begins in the dark. Jesus uses this image of being born in part to remind us who it is who does the work of new life. We might participate, cultivate, help, but it is God who labors to bring us to new life. God who labors to bring all of creation into the light. All of us were physically born once, and I'm reasonably sure that none of us did very much to contribute to the effort. This is why our faith is enriched by images of God as mother, alongside images of God as father. To be born is to be labored for, and it is God who is always laboring to bring new light into our darkness. Sometimes we move from darkness to light in a moment, and sometimes it takes a lifetime. Some of us make the move just once and manage to stay in the light from that point onward, though most of us know there's a bit more back and forth than that. But moving toward the light is what the season of Lent is all about. We began with Ash Wednesday's stark reminder of our mortality, our human limits. And Lent culminates with the holy meal of Maundy Thursday and then the deep darkness of Good Friday. It is the darkness that makes the bright light of Easter Sunday possible, that makes the resurrection such good news. God's gift of life is born in the dark, promising that light and life are always possible. But in the end, none of this really answers the question with which we began: how can these things be? Even as people who live here and now, even as people who know the Easter story, as people who try to walk in the light, we still find ourselves in times of darkness. The world still looks terribly broken. We still feel broken. The good news we hear on Sundays still seems too good to be true. We still wonder how these things can be. If I were a betting woman, I'm not, I'm a Methodist, I would bet that Nicodemus still wondered. I know I do. How can these things be? In many ways, it is the enduring question of our lives. It's a question whose answer might always elude us. The wind blows where it chooses. But Jesus reminds Nicodemus and reminds us of the truth of our faith. For God so loved the world that God gave God's only Son so that everyone who believes in him may have life. When we allow ourselves to be born up again by God, not just believing with our minds, but also believing with our hearts and our hands, we help God to be born once again into the world. And even in our deepest darkness, God is always bearing us up, inviting us to be born over and over again into light and life. Perhaps today you are in the middle of a deep darkness, unable to catch even a glimpse of light. Or maybe this morning you awoke to bright new light shining in your darkness, overwhelming it completely. Probably you're somewhere in between, experiencing both light and dark. Wherever you find yourself, know this: you are not alone. How can this be? For God so loved the world, even in its darkest moments, that God took on flesh and dwelt among us. God lived our life and died our death, bringing light and life to all. In light, in darkness, in light beyond darkness, God is with us. We are not alone. Thanks be to God. Amen.